hitting record, and I am going to let the fine folks into the Zoom room. Here they come. All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to the field trip. Lovely to see you all here. I'm going to give everyone a few moments to get settled in. Going to give those who might need a couple more moments to come into the room some time to do so. But while we wait, while we get settled, maybe grab yourself a nice beverage, get in a comfy seat, and then we would love for you to answer in the chat our warm-up question today. And that is, are you or have you ever been a member of a co-op? And if you'd like to add, which one, if so? So if you want to answer that in the chat, we would love to have your answers, and we'll give everyone a couple more moments to get settled. Hugs to you, Olivier. Nice to see you. Hey, always a pleasure. Hello to those of you just joining us. We have a warm-up question today. If you feel comfortable answering it in the chat, we'd love your answers. Are you or have you ever been a member of a co-op? And if so, which one? If you want to let us know the answer to that for you in the chat, and we're going to get started in just a moment here. Just giving folks a chance to come on into the room and get settled. Alrighty, it is about that time. Welcome everybody. My name is Lauren and I'm going to be your field trip support today. It's so wonderful to have so many awesome folks here. I have a couple of quick notes before we dive in. The first is that if you have any tech issues at all today during the field trip, please direct message me. That way we can keep the chat clear and focus on our awesome topic at hand. It can be a little bit overwhelming if everyone's getting the message that maybe your sound isn't working. So just direct those to me and I am more than happy to help you. For those of you on camera, can I get a thumbs up for that? Feeling good? Maybe. Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Naomi. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Olivier. Amazing stuff. Thanks so much. All right. And another note I have before we dive in is that field trips are learning experiences for you, the participants, and also for hosts. So at Creative Mornings, we like to start off every field trip with something we call confetti. It's a way to cheer on our host and each other for showing up. It's so cool that you're here. It's so cool you're taking the time out for you to learn. And I'm just so excited. So it's going to help us put faces to the experience, and that way we remember we're all here together. And there are two ways to do confetti. First is with cameras on. So if you haven't already and you want to, I invite you to put your camera on. In a moment, I'm going to invite you to light up your screen with a dance or jazz hands, whatever feels good. And the other way is chat confetti. So if camera off is better for you today, no worries. That way you can just fill in the chat with emojis, words, whatever feels good. All right, let's do it. 3, 2, 1, confetti. Yay. Oh my gosh, I will never get sick of that. It's so awesome. All right, we're ready to start, everyone. Of course, there's no pressure to keep your camera on, but as you can see, it's so nice to see each other's faces. So if it feels good for you, we'd love for you to keep your camera on. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to our wonderful host, Matthew. Take it away, Matthew.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lauren. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you so much for the confetti and all the enthusiasm. I really, really appreciate all that. And yeah, letting me know a little bit about where folks are coming from on your co-op journey. Seems like we've got some folks who've been members of like grocery co-ops before. So we've got different levels and experiences in the chat here. So definitely feel free to keep those coming. And I'm going to be sharing my screen to get folks oriented to my presentation. So we're going to go for this. And presentation view. All right, I see it. One thumbs up. Looks like it's working. Okay, great. All right, so full disclosure, I'm a bit nervous. So one of the things I typically do when I get nervous is I speak quickly. So if anybody like wants this, like slow down sort of thing, like I forget what the hand motion typically is for slow down. It's like one of these maybe, whatever the hand motion is. Yeah, like you can just say like, slow down a little bit. There is a lot here though. So if I feel a little like I'm moving quickly, that's why, because I'm trying to hopefully get through all the content. So let's start with just a quick word about who I am. Who the heck am I? What am I doing here? So my name is Matthew. I go by he, him. That's my email. You will have my contact information if anybody wants to show up. I'm based in Northeast Georgia. I'm about an hour outside of Atlanta. I'm on the unceded land of the Eastern Cherokee, Yuchi, and Muskogee tribes in so-called Athens, Georgia. quick snapshot of my life. So I grew up in South Florida. That's me on the left. I'm second from the left next to my father. That's us at Disney World. We went there quite a bit. Big Disney family, just like an hour outside of Orlando. It was the 90s. That was style back then. You can see as we kind of go around here, that was my first co-op that I was ever a part of, Daily Groceries Co-op here in Athens, Georgia. It's a small grocery co-op. Big ups to them. They just moved their location, actually. So they're in a bigger store now, which is amazing. So I'm just very proud of them right now. On the right there, next to the Peapod costume that I'm in, that's the Georgia Cooperative Development Center. So shout out to Eric Simpson, who I noticed is on the board of directors of the Georgia Co-op Development Center. So we help co-ops get started in Georgia. And on the bottom, we've got two different photos of some of my international travels to see co-ops. On the lower left, that's me in Spain. So I'm in Basque Spain, northern Spain, with the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. And then on the lower right, I actually just got back. I was in Emilia-Romagna, northern Italy, studying some of their co-ops. So kind of different shades of some of my co-op experience to come here to you today to talk to you. So again, kind of packed agenda. Gonna try to move quickly, but also not too quickly. First of all, the housekeeping, thank you so much, Lauren, for handling that. These slides, again, will be available, so no one has to write furiously to keep up with the notes. We're going to go over some of the basics, like what is a co-op? What's the definition of it? Then I want to move towards some storytelling to give you some of the real lived experience of people who have actually started these things. And then a little bit about to help you all, if you're actually in the space of thinking about how would I start one for myself? Or if you're in a business that might be receptive to this, converting a business into a cooperative, and what might that look like? And I'm trying to reserve about 10 minutes at the end for Ask Me Anything. And I'm being polite. Please ask me anything. So without further ado, what is a co-op? So it's a mouthful of a definition. I'm not going to read the whole thing, and you'll find there's a few of these slides where I've put in content. Don't worry, I'm never going to just read a block of text to you, but I just want to call certain things to your attention when we talk about a co-op. First of which is that in that I put in. So that means noun, right? So we're talking about co-op noun. These are persons, places, right? Like any noun, person, place, or thing. Typically a thing, typically a business. So that's the first thing to notice about a cooperative as I'm using it today. I also want to point out that we have an association. So the word association here, I think, is in the spirit of kind of like we're typically think of nonprofit organizations. Associations are groups of people who have some kind of a purpose that they've come together for. You and your neighbors are addressing some challenge that you're facing. You form an association to help address a problem. But secondly, there's an enterprise. And so that's where we get in the sense of forming a business. We're in the market, we have some kind of a good or service, we're generating revenue, but we're going to bring those worlds together, right? We're going to have a purpose-driven business is kind of the big idea of any cooperative. So once that kind of is established, what we're doing is we're trying to address two things. So we call out both needs and aspirations. So these people have come together, they have certain needs. We all have basic needs, you got that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's the basic things like clothing, food, shelter, but we have lots of other needs, right? We need to be, socially connected to each other. We need to have dignified employment, living wages. We need to address, the need for access to green spaces, all sorts of things, that we have these different needs. But also we have aspirations too. So there's a certain world that we want to live in, and those are kind of the aspirational things that we're also aiming at when we form cooperative businesses. So if we can do all that together, that's kind of what a co-op is. Next, lastly, I want to draw attention to these two words, ownership and control, because I think these have very particular meanings here, and we'll talk a lot about what ownership and control really look like in co-op space. We're talking about the ownership of a thing, right? And thus so I want to talk about, so ownership matters is what I'm trying to say, right? So some of my colleagues have formed this newsletter called Ownership Matters, and it's a space where it's explored, what do we mean by ownership and why does it matter? And I think that's a really important question to explore. So why does ownership matter? Why are we talking about that here today? Well, so let's just imagine a food supply chain here in which we have at least these three different types of stakeholders, right? So on the left, of course, we have farmers. So I'm calling them producers or suppliers. As you can see in our image here, we've got farmers who are growing crops. They're, of course, once they're growing those crops, they're going to actually bring them into some kind of a retail location, like a grocery store, for example, right? So workers or employees or founders, if they're, a small grocery store like the one where I started, they actually buy those crops that are grown by farmers. Then they have a retail location where they sell them. Well, that of course wouldn't be complete without consumers who are ultimately going to buy those groceries, right? So this is kind of like a very simplified idea of a supply chain of like how it is that food arrives to us in the world, right? And when we think about ownership, typically, even though like we have such essential players here, right? We call them like in different co-op languages, we call these stakeholders either patrons, they can be called members, they can be called users. But oftentimes when we talk about ownership, a whole new category of stakeholder kind of appears, and that's an investor stakeholder. So that's a person who is going to provide some money so that a business will now exist, right? So then cash is then infused to this kind of made up retail grocery store that we're talking about. And then suddenly something happens when that money transfers. This sense of ownership then takes shape of like, now, okay, because money has entered the equation, ownership is being conveyed back to that investor in exchange for that money. But that leaves an open question in my mind, which is, what about those farmers? Did they get ownership? What about the employees who work at that grocery store? And what about the consumers who shop there? We kind of just said like they're the ones who are the most essential in the aspect of like growing food and making it available to people. And yet ownership doesn't really sit with them typically in most businesses. So to kind of drill down a little bit more in terms of like, what are we really talking about? Is it all just like roses when you own things? Well, sure, there's like rights that come with ownership, right? So this is the idea of property. You know, when you own something, it's yours. You might have a receipt that says this thing is yours, right? That's a sense of ownership of something. Typically, what we're talking about, though, with ownership and why it matters is we talk about control. We can make decisions about the things that we own. You know, because of the fact that like I own a toothbrush, I can control that. I can use it to brush my teeth, right? That's the control of the thing that I own. And then there's a benefit, right? I get clean teeth out of it. So that's the kind of the way that like ownership, control, and benefit all kind of get wrapped up into the ownership of things like businesses. And I put a little asterisk here, right? So I say, you know, you can make decisions about what you own. That's not to say that like all decisions are made by everyone in a cooperative. I think that's a very common misconception. Some decisions, delegation is still a thing in co-ops. But on the flip side of rights, the other side of that coin is also responsibilities. So we should also be stewards of the things that we take ownership of. And so that's for better or for worse. You know, that toothbrush might become not at all pretty or nice. And like we cleaned out the sink with it, right? And you still own it. It may not be pleasant. It may not do the thing you meant it to do. You still own it though. The control might look differently in that situation. And when it comes to like the control of businesses, there's actually like this responsibility that you should be informed about, you know, the thing that you control, especially with cooperatives, because like when you take ownership of a business, you also need to keep abreast of it, right? Like, how is it doing? What is the financial health of it? How is it performing, you know, both financially and socially, that sort of thing. And then also the benefit aspect comes with a certain amount of participation, right? So if you don't use a cooperative that you own, then ultimately it starts to fail over time, right? It's a business, so it depends upon revenue. So that's the sense in which we talk about what's called member economic participation, also called Principle 3, which is the part of the 7 cooperative principles, which we won't touch on here, but it's in the appendix for folks who are curious. So to put it really simply, to like give you like a really clear distinction between what I'm talking about when I say business as usual, that's what I'm calling the investor-owned firm, which could also be like, this could apply to small businesses too, actually, which that are not cooperatively practicing. But typically speaking, the rule of the day is $1, 1 vote. In other words, more capital is being contributed into a business, more power thereby, therefore more control is conveyed by more economic participation. In a co-op, that's not true, and that gets totally flipped on its head, and in fact becomes 1 person, 1 vote. Or as they say in Italy, where I just was, 1 head, 1 vote. You know, each person then becomes equal, regardless of how much money they have. They have an equal power to make a vote on those key decisions that affect the future of any given cooperative. So I wanted to then, you know, move away from just the theory of what we're talking about and do an actual little bit of storytelling, so you can actually get a sense of who are some of these people and what are we really talking about here. So the first example I wanted to lift up is a co-op called CPA, or Community Purchasing Alliance. So they are technically a consumer cooperative, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. But what they're doing is they're helping others, specifically churches and congregations, make purchases together. You know, that's why they say Purchasing Alliance. So this fabulous group of now 13, this is 11 folks, they're growing quickly. They're based in the DC area, formed this cooperative. they were responding to a story that they were hearing over and over again, which is, as you see at the top here, we spend more money on electric bills than we do on our clergy's salary. So you hear that from a church and you're like, does that make sense? Seems like, well, okay, there's one piece of, okay, like, like, are all of your windows open when your AC's on? Like, you could see, like, is it an efficiency thing? Like, that's a lot on electric bills. But if you're finding, like, over and over again, like, all the houses of worship are having the same problem, like, they're just being exorbitantly charged for electricity. Maybe there's something that can be done to help those folks. Again, going back to, like, what are the needs that can be addressed with co-ops? So their idea was, what about a co-op that pools together the buying power of all those different houses of worship? And in fact, as you can see at the bottom, started to invite other people along too. So schools, mostly charter schools, I think, retirement communities, housing co-ops, and other nonprofit organizations also joined buying power with those houses of worship and formed this purchasing alliance, which now has leveraged over $20 million in annual purchasing. And not only that, to reduce the price that every one of those churches is paying, but on top of that, who they're buying from has a further positive impact because they're lifting up specifically buying from local businesses and Black-owned, other people of color-owned businesses when they do that purchasing on behalf of those churches. So it's like this really cool kind of closed loop in which, multiple aspects of solidarity end up coming to the fore. So again, lots of savings involved, $120 million worth of purchasing has arisen from this, as well as some peer-led decision-making, which led to better contract terms, time saved, and support, all have arisen from that. And so if you're thinking about specifically, we mentioned security at the top there, but we mentioned electricity, but we've also got like HVAC, we've got gas, we've got, cleaning services, all these things that each one of these houses of worship needs, they can now buy it together and thus for less. So this is kind of like the first example I wanted to share, like what a co-op is really for, what it's about, that we can solve problems together in that way. Now, I want to come back to my theoretical model about a grocery store, and then start to use this question to get at a different way of looking at the ownership of businesses. So I'm going to start on the right and I'm going to move backward. So the first kind of co-op we're going to talk about here is a consumer cooperative. Those people who are making the actual purchasing, buying in the stores that we're talking about that are cooperatively owned. So we won't touch on all of these, but these are just some of the flavors of consumer ownership that are practiced. I think, every one of these actually is in the United States, but this is around the world as well, of course. Things like credit unions where you can do your banking, REI where you can do your outdoor equipment shopping, electric co-ops. Co-op City is a network of housing cooperatives in New York City. Hey Kinfolk is an online consumer goods made by Black-owned businesses kind of network that it's owned by the customers who buy online. But the example I wanted to hone in on, and you'll see the way I've kind of structured this, I also have like a specific example I want to say a little bit more about, is the Sevananda Co-op. So they're kind of in my backyard. They're in Atlanta, the natural food market there, which has been around since 1974. Like many of their brethren in the consumer co-op space, they're more natural foods oriented. They provide quality whole foods to shoppers and members of Atlanta and surrounding cities throughout Georgia. Their mission is about facilitating democratic participation, natural and organic foods. The third bullet here is education on cooperative principles and beneficial relationships with local community. Back in the 70s, this was like a really novel thing. Major grocery stores had never heard of kombucha, for example. There's plenty of these things that now we might take for granted. Things like almond milk, for example, like that was just nowhere to be found back in the 70s. And like folks like Sevananda really led the way in changing the market so that consumers had more choices. And that's one of the positive impacts that really happens with consumer ownership, is that like things we can't otherwise access are coming into our access, our kind of field of options because of consumer co-ops. And every now and then you get a celebrity to drop in. And I thought this was really cool and neat. So I thought I'd just quickly share. Steve Harvey showed up at Sevananda recently.
Y'all listen, I'm your man, Steve Harvey, and I'm here in Sevananda. And I just discovered this grocery store, and it is the bomb. I'm coming in here. I finally got some stuff I wanted to try because I'm off dairy now. And so this store has everything in it. Look, you can eat anything in here. I don't know who wants this, but they got it for you. It's all natural. It's vegan and vegetarian, but everybody wants to eat healthy. This is the place to come, and I recommend it highly. That's a free commercial.
He's true to his word. That's exactly what it was. Sometimes you just luck out, right? And so, yeah, he's like speaking to the things that we're talking about, right? So like consumer access, consumer power that comes with, you're worried about your diet, you're looking out for yourself. A consumer co-op can be a great way to do that, right? To really center your ability to access things like, organic. Now many things are gluten-free, for example, etc.
Y'all listen.
So I want to move again. So this time we're going to move toward the centerpiece here. So what if in this, kind of matrix of business ownership, we think about the workers or employees? What if they're the ones who then are owners of a business? So again, this has many different applications. I mean, the truth of the matter is that any type of business can be a cooperative. So these are just some examples that I can throw, but really anything could be. But to give you kind of a flavor of like, what are some of the maybe cooler ones that I know about and I'm really excited about. Cooperative Home Care Associates is actually the biggest worker co-op in the United States. It's based in the Bronx. It's mostly Latina women who are performing home care services for, otherwise elderly or otherwise disabled folks. Aorta is a consultancy cooperative of folks who are doing anti-oppression training with different types of businesses and nonprofit organizations. Up there in the top is the Drivers Cooperative. So this is the Uber alternative in New York City, which is actually owned by the drivers themselves, taking on Uber, in fact, kind of amazing if you think about it. Madre Tierra is also a group of Latina women in the Virginia, DC, Maryland area. They're doing all sorts of different services, including translation as well as home cleaning, excuse me. And then Isthmus Engineering is a group of engineers who work on all kinds of, machine tools, other types of, industrial technologies in Madison, Wisconsin. So it really does run the gamut. But the one I wanted to particularly hone in on was ChiFresh Kitchen, which is based in Chicago, Illinois. So their kind of theory of change was that they could bring together primarily women who were formerly incarcerated and form a catering cooperative, creating what they call food from the heart, serving daily meals, fresh cooked food, rooted in culture and traditions of the people being served. It's also healthy and delicious. As with Sevananda, thinking about things like nutritional needs, culture, allergies, food sensitivities, and dietary preferences, but also proudly worker-owned. So as they say, structured as a worker cooperative, where every worker has the opportunity to share in governance as well as the profits of the business. And they're also thinking about who it is that they're inviting in as worker owners. So they're predominantly serving those who live on the south or west sides of Chicago. So for them, it kind of grew out of pandemic that this need was becoming more apparent for formerly incarcerated women. I mean, always, I think, apparent, but something that they could step into, particularly in that moment of the pandemic, as an employment opportunity for formerly incarcerated women, a way to, as they say, push ideas like non-hierarchical ownership, with each owner worker sharing in the decision-making about very day-to-day things like the menus that the catering cooperative would then create, which the pandemic then lifted up for them. And you see some of the examples here, some of the benefits that come out of this, such as we set our own wages and have meetings on a regular basis. I want to make the company work for me. And that, of course, goes with the unsaid there, not work for the company, make the company work for me, which is something that I think a lot of worker owners experience. So the third part and final part to this introduction to the types of ownership that you typically see, there will be three of the four, but we'll get to the fourth in a second, is the producer supplier ownership piece. So in this case, like the farmers, what if they're the ones who take ownership of a business, also known as a co-op? So some examples that are most common, most people think of in the US context are farmer cooperatives, but really it's not limited to farmers. So for example, here in the lower left is Stocksy United. This is a stock photography cooperative. So they're actually owned by the photographers who each independently have their own photography businesses. They use the co-op to market the product, which is their stock photography, and sell it for them through an aggregated kind of hub online. So they have better access to market, through the co-op, which is typically, like what producer co-ops are there for. They're amplifying the power of individual producers through some kind of a larger entity, just as with Organic Valley. And Eric Simpson, who I mentioned is here right now, is one of the, not founders, but kind of chief proprietors right now at the West Georgia Farmers Cooperative. So they've been around since '66. One of the founding members of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, sort of I say like Apex Black Farmer Cooperative Initiative and Network, deeply enmeshed with our civil rights movement, as well as the effort for Black farmers to have independence as producers in our country. Lots of interesting and challenging history with that. Also mentioned here is the chocolate rebellion. So these folks are chocolate producers in the global South, African and Caribbean handmade chocolates selling to the global North, but with ownership to the actual chocolate producers in the global South. But the example I wanted to dig most into is called the Ujamaa Collective. So these folks are based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The way they describe themselves, they meet at the intersection of art, culture, and entrepreneurship. They're a national cooperative model. They're seeking to be a catalyst to advance Africana women, providing a fair trade marketplace for the cultural, artistic, and entrepreneurial exchange through cooperative economics in their area, which is the Hill District and beyond. And we lift as we climb, being able to sell through the market that they've created together. Featuring, again, talented local and global Africana artisan networks with their shared vision, values, purpose, work, and wealth. This here is the boutique on the left, which is kind of their flagship, where they sell, again, producer-owned, so Africana artisans who are producing the goods that are then sold in the retail location in Pittsburgh. And some of the founders here on the right as well, practicing very direct fair trade. They got their start in 2008. They had this concept to pull forth a call to action for Black women to come to the table, sharing ideas about business and community development, which heavily included Africana examples of financial exchange. They've to date serviced over 175 different independent artists and entrepreneurs and thousands of customers through their retail front. Now, this is the curveball one, because there's a fourth category here. And so what happens if we start to mix and match these? What about a remix of some of the concepts we've just gone over? So let's just an example of where both producers and workers own the same business together as a cooperative. So that will be the example we'll get to in a second. These, however, are also examples of multi-stakeholder cooperatives, which again, mix and match different ownership types. The Zebras Unite Cooperative brings together consultancy providers who provide consultant services to zebra companies. With their founders. They also have other groups of folks who are engaged in the act of encouraging these zebra businesses, which are alternatives to unicorns. Really fascinating. We don't have the time to dig into like what is a zebra versus what is a unicorn, but I strongly encourage folks to look into it if you're not familiar. The Eroski groceries in Basque Spain, which is actually owned by both the consumers and the workers. So they have a hybrid grocery cooperative model there in northern Spain. Boisaco's in French Canada, they're like a lumber cooperative. So they're owned by both the lumber distributors, the people who own the land itself, as well as the processors. And Navajo in the lower left, Navajo Home Power is a Navajo Nation, Hopi Nation collaboration in which they collaborate to produce electricity for themselves on still very much like unelectrified land, which hard to imagine, right? It's 2023 and there's still places in the United States that don't have electricity, but that's the reality that we live in. So finding cooperative solutions like this can, again, back to needs, right? This is how we meet needs quite often. So I wanted to lift up Radish Cooperative as my kind of case study here about multi-stakeholder cooperatives. So they're, I wish I could say that they're in the US, but they are in fact food delivery in Montreal, sourcing from locally sourced restaurants. It's kind of like you'd say like a DoorDash, but the cooperative alternative to that, right? So they're a restaurant technology cooperative jointly owned by both restaurateurs, shouldn't say both, all of the above, restaurateurs, delivery drivers, and consumers as well. So each of them has a different kind of ownership stake in the Radish Cooperative, doing what they consider to be preserving the future of the restaurant industry. Again, another, I think, product of the pandemic, in fact, was looking at the structures behind food delivery. And can we do this? Introducing more of a shared ownership model. And they've also kind of innovated in many other ways. So you can see in the last paragraph, they are innovating in areas of inventory management, sales forecasting, marketing, consulting. They develop hardware as well as algorithms to reduce environmental impact. So again, many different creative, innovative kind of things coming out of the fact that we've practiced this kind of shared ownership model. So now we're going to shift gears again. And looks like I'm doing okay on time. So yay. So we're starting co-ops. So now we're going to move toward the idea again of like, if you're in the space where if you have the means, you have the ability, like, what does it mean to really look like, what would it look like to start a cooperative? What are some of the mechanics behind that? How might you do it? Who helps with that sort of thing? So there's at least 3 different approaches to, what I typically call cooperative development, which is just like it sounds, right? Like, how do you form, how do you help co-ops come into existence? So the 3 ways that I will talk about here are I'm calling DIY or facilitated or incubated and franchised. So that I'm going to also kind of put this along a spectrum of what I first call the no touch option, the low touch option, and the high touch option. And this here refers to the level in which we're bringing in facilitators who actually will, be sort of third parties who will help create that cooperative from the outside. So with the first up, the no touch DIY option. So just like it sounds, this is the do-it-yourself way. So you're going to get together with your folks, you're going to study up, use the resources online, and just kind of do it yourself. So the first resource that I wanted to lift up here is called the Solidarity Resource, which is a newly created, many veteran cooperative developers, many of them BIPOC, who have experienced cooperative development in different facets, came together to form this toolkit that they're calling the Anti-Racist Facilitation Guide to Cooperative Development. So I wanted to touch on kind of the way that they put the journey in front of folks about like, what would it look like to create a cooperative? So it has 5 modules. So we start with preparing for the journey, finding alignment, building a viable organization, structuring that cooperative, and then thinking about a union relationship. Should this be a union cooperative? And we can get into some of those mechanics. So when we're preparing for the journey, we're centering inner work. And I think this is something that, like, in my experience, is often missing from cooperative journeys, is thinking about the inner work aspect of business development, right? If we're just throwing it out there to the world, like, oh, I have an invention, I have a new app that I think is going to change the world. It's a social media app, whatever. Oftentimes it's about that external kind of projecting out to the world of like, here's a successful business idea. I need to go find investors, and that's all that there is, right? It's a very external process, but they're intentionally beginning with the inner work as a foundation for collective work, starting from a place of self-reflection, exploring power and privilege. How does that show up as we form a group of people who will create a business together? And how do we keep making sure we check in on our vibe? How are we feeling about this process? Are we stretched? Do we feel like we're not doing the work? Are we doing too much of the work? How is it happening? So once we move on from some of that inner work, and I think you could definitely say like the inner work continues throughout all of these processes, now we're also starting to dream together. We're finding alignment on our co-op development project. What is it? What does that need? What is that aspiration that this co-op is ultimately going to address? Asking big questions like, how did we get here? What are the circumstances that produced a need that a business will ultimately serve? Where do we want to go when we're dreaming together? And coming from like an asset-based thinking model of like, well, what is my role in the project? What do I bring? What are my unique contributions? What are my commitments? What's my vision for the co-op as it fits in with others? And then we're starting to get into, again, with like power and privilege, like decision-making habits. Are some folks used to doing more of the talking? Some folks more used to doing less of the talking. Talk about how it is we make decisions together, how it is we set our planning table, so to speak. And then using some concrete tools, like we have this decision-making matrix that some co-op developers use, including myself, where we actually start to lay out, literally line by line, like, here are types of decisions that we need to make. Who are the different stakeholders, and what level of involvement does each type of stakeholder have in a given decision? It can get incredibly granular, right? Of like, we think that, the customers who live in this neighborhood should be able to provide input on this type of product. Like, it can be as granular as you want it to be when you come up with a decision-making matrix. And then we're getting into building a viable organization. So again, connecting back to that why, defining our values, so what it is that we believe in, sharing our gifts, our people power, and then getting into some of the, shall we say, technical things, aspects of it too, right? So we can't really proceed without a financial model. We need to understand revenue sources. Will this venture be sustainable for the long run in terms of the way that we generate revenue? Will we make more money consistently than we're spending? That sort of thing. the financial planning, the modeling that then also helps us project those things into the future. What do we think is reasonable? What are those kind of worst case scenario, maybe middle of the road scenario, or best case scenario to how it is we're projecting financially for whatever this business might be. And then the capital access. And so this is getting at like, if it's a loan from a bank, if it's a grant from a CDFI, all these different ways we can look at the money that is required to start a business. All of that kind of is getting baked into this middle area of building a viable organization. And then we think about how do we structure it. So when we talk about membership, some of the things I've just laid out kind of introduce like how it is we can think about stakeholders, right? Are we looking at producers? Are we looking at workers? Are we looking at consumers? Who has the stake in terms of rights and responsibilities to help inform the question of membership, of who will be the owners and thus the controllers of this business? Mapping out those stakeholders, naming who they are, who it is that's being impacted by this business, who has a stake in it, literally as a stakeholder. Member eligibility. So what is it that folks have to be willing to commit in terms of being eligible? If it's like, many cooperatives have a financial buy-in amount. So, some run the gamut, $5 to join a credit union, $10,000 to join a worker co-op. That's one example. That's more on the other end of the extreme, but it does vary quite a bit. So figuring things out like that, of like, what would that buy-in look like is part of member eligibility. The rights, again, rights and responsibilities, the trust that we build together, and then really designing our democracy. So understanding the cooperative relationship with hierarchy and direct versus representative governance. How directly do folks make decisions, or do they elect folks like a board of directors to make decisions for them? Setting the governance table, again, like a decision-making matrix, who can make what types of decisions, redefining leadership, what it means at the co-op and how it's different from traditional models. So what does bottom-up leadership look like in our cooperative? And being truly democratic in that sense of one person, one vote, all get kind of built in. And then the fifth and final piece of that being, again, the union relationship. So they're coming from a background in which they're presuming, probably they think the answer of the first question is a union right for our cooperative. I think assuming yes. There's other models, like there's like the union worker co-op model that very particularly bakes in, the idea of like from the get-go, what will this look like to have a union worker cooperative? I will say it's not as built out, unfortunately, in the other spaces like producer and consumer cooperatives. But there's just a very rich world of practice in the worker cooperative space of like finding the right union, as you see here, right? Forming a bargaining team, collective bargaining, designing those agreements, all those working hand in hand with the ownership and control aspects we've already been talking about, and having the union representation as like another stakeholder at the table to help the cooperative flourish. So there's other DIY resources. These are, again, these are self-paced options, all DIY. So like courses you can enroll online and then click through at your own leisure to help you develop a cooperative yourself. So then we're moving into the middle of the road here, what I'm calling low touch or facilitated cooperative development. So this is when someone like myself, for example, is asked to help out with a cooperative group that is already forming. They've got some idea and then they want some assistance with it, but they don't want to go as far on the right of like being incubated. They want to still have a fair amount of agency. That's not the right word. There should always be agency. They want to be in charge of more of the process, is I guess another way to say it, and get some help in the process. There's lots of different options if you're thinking about using a more facilitated approach. The center that we started in Georgia, the Georgia Co-op Development Center, we're members of this national network called Cooperation Works, which is the National Cooperative Development Network. It's a great way to find co-op developers in the United States who are trained in the ability to help others and help groups of people form cooperative businesses. So it can be a great resource if you're looking for that. The Co-op Clinic is specifically facilitated by the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. So they're very, much more pointedly focused on providing worker co-op assistance, but also a great team of folks to work with. More internationally, you've got the Mondragon Team Academy. They use kind of what they call a teampreneur model as opposed to an entrepreneurial model. They get students to actually form teams that will support the cooperative development process. And then Co-op Zone is also like Cooperation Works, but is more Canadian focused, but similar kind of concept. So to highlight one example of like kind of what does this look like, I pulled up a screenshot from the Keystone Development Center in Pennsylvania. So this is an example of kind of if you're looking for technical assistance from a TA provider, a cooperative development center, those folks, these are the types of services that you might expect to get from a facilitated process. So supporting exploration and expansion, whether that's business development, which includes some very core deliverables like feasibility analysis, forming a business plan, planning for a member equity drive, accounting services or funding support. All these things might get wrapped up into business development services that come with bringing on another entity like a cooperative development center to help form a cooperative. Many folks, including us here in Georgia, the Georgia Co-op Development Center, use a co-op academy structure. So kind of like it sounds, it's kind of like a cohort arrangement. It's a cooperative way to be cooperative, so it's like a way to bring many different co-ops together who are in similar kind of startup positions and all learn some of the same lessons together. So some of these core things like, co-op principles, values, and identity. What is a business model canvas? What's your legal and accounting? What's your marketing? All these different sort of core business fundamentals that we can do together as a group, as a cohort, and go through a 3-month process together, kind of like sometimes called a boot camp or an accelerator. What are the ways that we can make that more efficient by working together through that learning process? Using tools like the business model canvas, looking at, all these different pieces of what goes ultimately into a business plan, whether that's, co-op or other types of businesses. These are some of the types of kind of core questions that are addressed typically with cooperative developers to make sure we've got answers in all these different boxes about our businesses that'll ultimately produce, cooperatives that we might consider loan ready or investment ready, whoever that capital provider might be. We want to be able to demonstrate that we thought through a lot of the hard questions about our business model. And a lot of times the co-op developer is a champion or a steward to kind of make sure that we're ready for those types of hard questions that might come from our investors. Similarly, this being in fact, it isn't very directly a uniquely cooperative tool, the ownership model canvas, again, going back to rights and responsibilities, it's another planning tool that co-op developers will use to help answer some of the key questions about rights and responsibilities in relationships to stakeholders and who gets to do what, and who decides what. So this flower example here is what my kind of attempt to show that there's lots of different ways, and many in fact are not linear with each other. That's part of I really love the flower metaphor, because which of these were you supposed to do first? If you had to do all of these to start a co-op, it's easy to think okay, maybe I do them simultaneously. Some of them I'll have to do more than once. So there's really not one perfect way, of course, to start a cooperative. There's many different pieces that we'll always have to do, many of which we'll have to revisit. And you'll find that even within the world of cooperative development practice, each provider approaches it kind of differently, but typically hits off on some of the same concepts. To kind of underscore that point, our own U.S. Department of Agriculture has its own guide. You can see the picture in the background of how to start a cooperative. For them, there's 4 phases and 12 steps. Follow the steps and you've got a co-op, and that's how the USDA does it. Not the case if you looked at, how Georgia Co-op Development Center does it. You look at the way many different others do it, right? Including the solidarity resource that we started with the DIY approach, right? They all look different, but they're kind of hitting at similar things. So the last kind of development model I wanted to touch on is the incubated or franchised model. So this is what I call the high touch, or kind of the least in control, the least driving the ship sort of way of doing it, where you still want to form a co-op, but you'd really rather benefit from a lot of experience that's happened in a particular way, right? And as a side note, if anyone's wondering, this is in fact a blue-footed booby, and it is available to us here under a Creative Commons license. So I did not just pull this from the internet. I think about these things, it's a thing. So with incubated co-ops, there's at least 3 that I'm aware of that practice this kind of incubation, this kind of intensive high-touch model. But the first of which is Prospera. It's a Latina nonprofit organization that fosters specifically like cleaning cooperatives. So these are worker-owned cleaning co-ops that they understand very, very well. And kind of that's the way that they're using this replication model, is that, you know, the business model itself is very well understood. And so they're able to replicate it fairly quickly for folks, put them through a boot camp, do some of that internal work, do leadership skill development, and help folks actually start their own cleaning co-op businesses with shared services, you know, shared purchasing, shared, you know, learning development opportunities, that kind of thing. Center for Family Life. Actually, I've got slides for each of these, so I don't need to like just speak from the original one. So for their model, you know, they're kind of practicing this like connect, explore, launch, grow, lead, transform model, and creating this circularity effect where like they keep creating more of these particular types of cooperatives, because again, with each one that they create, they get better at the model and they find it a little easier each time, right? Center for Family Life kind of follows a similar model, but theirs is a bit more varied. So they've thus to date incubated 22 different co-ops, helped generate over 400 worker owners, 650,000 generated from the Up and Go platform, which is a platform that was made to support cleaning cooperatives, worker-owned cleaning co-ops, and more than 60 NGOs have been trained in that process. Okay, I missed the slide where I'd laid out, but they have multiple different, like many of them are social service kind of related, but not necessarily like all in like cleaning or home care. The SISMIC program up in Quebec to date has established over 300 partnerships, helped over 7,000 people, and incubated over 400 projects, each of which would become its own either co-op or some kind of like social solidarity economy enterprise. And to kind of give you a quick sense of like what all these are about, we've got an art museum, we've got a ski resort, and a skate park have all been incubated by the same organization to help them get started. So more variability in terms of the incubation that they engage in. Similarly with like the co-op franchise notion, you know, we've all heard of, I think, you know, like you start, I think most of us probably think of fast food when we think of franchises, but couldn't we do something kind of like that in the sense of like a replicable model with co-ops? And the answer is yes. So we see a few of those around the country. Just focusing here on the Arizmendi Association in the San Francisco Bay Area. They started off as a worker cooperative called the Cheese Board. In 95, they formed an association of the co-ops that had formed, each of which is now called an Arizmendi Bakery. They're all part of the Cheese Board network. And now the Cheese Board Collective offers its recipes, its organizational structure, startup funding, as well as their name in all of the marketing of each new replicated bakery that's now part of their network. So they can keep generating worker-owned bakeries in their network. And you can kind of see like how it is that they each chip in. Each individual unit contributes to the whole pot of funding that is necessary to create new bakeries out of that network. Now with conversions, and I see that we are almost out of time, so I'm going to have to move pretty quickly for this because I want to save 10 minutes for Q&A. This is all about conversion. So any of the types of co-ops we looked at, whether it's producer, worker, or consumer, any of those different types could become a conversion. In other words, any type of business could become any of those types of co-ops. I hone in here on worker-owned conversions because this is where most of the practice has occurred, and thus much of like the resources available to assist in conversion work is toward worker co-ops. So worker-owned businesses that have bought out their business become worker co-ops through conversion. The time can vary quite a bit. You know, typically no shorter than 18 months are necessary. Typically no more than 5 years are necessary to convert an existing business into a worker cooperative. We go through these different stages. We have to explore the concept. We obviously have to assess it to look at many of the same things we've already looked at, like what is the financial, you know, outlook for that business? Is it successful enough to warrant conversion, et cetera? What will be the structure of that co-op? How will we execute our different documents? And what kind of support long-term will be necessary for that? And again, folks will have the slides. So my call to action to all of you, what can you do right now? Well, you could get off this creative mornings presentation right now and buy something from a co-op. Hey Kinfolk is a great place to do that. The links are right there. Just look up Hey Kinfolk on Google and you can buy from a co-op right there, right? Easy as that. If you want to work with a co-op, maybe a worker co-op, for example, the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops has a very active jobs page. You can find a job working in a worker cooperative. if you were looking for maybe just like a way to actually get a flavor of it for yourself, I've got a link here about how to start a cooking cooperative. It's just a way for a group of friends to like make meals and just share those meals together. Sharing meals together is one of the oldest and like well-established informal types of cooperatives, right? So we're just sharing the fact that we cook meals together with each other, kind of like potluck logic. That's a kind of cooperative. Join a co-op as a member. You can be a customer member, a worker owner, or a producer owner. And with that, please ask me anything.
Yay, Matthew. Oh my goodness. So much valuable information was just shared. I hope you get a chance to look at the chat later when we send out the recording, because yeah, we're all obsessed with you and what you've just shared with us. So thank you so much for this joyful hour. There are a few questions coming in. If you haven't had a chance, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A. Let's go to Olivier's question. I see in the visual producers, workers, customers, and investors. Is there any risk that a co-op could go on a wrong way if the investors are driving its goals in despite of the will of the rest? How to prevent this without investors going away?
Yeah, thank you, Olivier. So let me, sorry, can I see that in writing? Is that?
Oh, that one was in a DM to me, but let me copy it and send it to you. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's a few parts to that, but if I'm understanding correctly, it's kind of about like making sure that the mission and the vision is not being lost when some of those stakeholders want to go in a different direction.
I've just popped it in the chat if that's easier.
Okay. Yes. Okay, cool. And is there any risk that a co-op could go on a wrong way if the investors are driving its goals in despite of the will of the rest? Yeah, certainly. I mean, without investors to go away. Yeah, I mean, I think getting really clear about like what is the purpose of the cooperative is really essential. And trying to do that as early as we can and trying to be very public with that, aspect. There's different ways that some co-ops have like tried to preserve their identity through like, having their bylaws written in such a way that like basically like any kind of deviation from this purpose that is written in the bylaws actually kind of produces like a poison pill effect. Basically, like the co-op will more or less have to demutualize if this aspect of the mission is kind of abridged in some way. So there's different ways that co-ops kind of try to creatively approach that, where they kind of try to protect the purpose and thus give some assurance to investors that like the reason for the co-op existing will continue to be that way for the long term. So typically there's like legal mechanisms for that. Otherwise, it's largely cultural stuff, like how do we bake into the co-op the kind of mores that kind of keep the values and the vision kind of front of mind.
Awesome. Thank you for the question, Olivier. Next question is from Naomi. Naomi says, we just started our co-op. We are in our first months. What are your top 3 tips for brand new co-ops? What do you wish you'd known?
Yeah. First tip for a brand new co-op would probably be stay vigilant. And I guess what I mean by that is like keep a good eye on like at least 2 different like aspects of success, one of which is like your economic indicators of success, but also your social indicators of success. And don't let either one get out of your sight. Because I find that like co-ops typically go one way or the other. They typically like really hone in on like, we have to be economically successful, or the other way, they're very much like, we need to deliver on this mission. We need to be very socially successful. So if you can keep at least one metric in each of those lanes and keep them in your sight line, don't let go.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for the question, Naomi. The next question is from Kathleen. Kathleen says, I love how you shared the example of the Radish Cooperative, going over how they're innovating with algorithms and other technology, all coming out of a shared ownership model. This got me inspired and curious, understanding in today's age, AI has opened up a world of new possibilities for our creative industries. In your opinion, how do you see the future of AI impacting co-op spaces?
Oh, no big deal, right? How does AI impact co-ops? What do we think about the future of that? I think AI presents another kind of very interesting technology that in many ways, like we were kind of on the precipice of with other previous technologies, like once upon a time, maybe email felt threatening, in a way that like now AI does. I think there's a lot of hype initially about like how disruptive we think a technology will be that maybe won't necessarily bear out. But the long-term consequences, I think, are something to really pay attention to for cooperatives. And I think that paying attention to the ownership of data will become really, really crucial in the future. And, I work for a data cooperative myself, Savvy Co-op. I didn't get a chance to really talk about that aspect, but like keeping our eyes on the ownership of data and thus who has ownership. And then like we talked about here, control of data will be really, really crucial about like how AI develops. Because if we don't have any ownership or control over what AI is doing and what it's generating, I think it'll be continue like outside of our control and thus like easily used to exploit social movements and people-driven movements like cooperatives. So I think we need to pay really close attention to the ownership and control of data.
Thank you, Matthew. Jessica asks, this one's in the chat, I'm trying to understand the different benefits that customers, workers, and producers gain when they all are being part of a hybrid co-op. And she says, thanks, this is a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, I really love that question. I thank you for asking that. I think this is part of why like multi-stakeholder cooperatives are such complicated and exciting animals, is because when you do bring those three different, seemingly very disparate groups of interests into one ownership model, you're trying to strike a very fine line that benefits all of them and in some ways benefits none of them, in the sense of like each of them has a trade-off element to where they're not really getting their way, wholly speaking, because they're having to share that power and responsibility with one other group. So I've thought about this a ton in the food space because I was in the grocery world for so long. And so what I think that looks like is striking a fair equilibrium whereby like farmers are paid fairly for their crops, workers are paid dignified wages, and consumers are paying fair prices. And like, that's a moving target, to be able to hit that sweet spot where like all three of those are getting a fair cut from the cooperative. But that's the beautiful work of cooperation, right? Is that we have to each show up at the table and like create a truly win-win-win where all three types are actually coming away victorious in the end.
Thank you. Joanna and Naomi are both wondering about common challenges in co-ops. So major challenges in building co-ops. Would it be something like getting everyone agreed with a decision? And how do you manage to deal when someone in the co-op is not okay with a decision?
Yeah, I love that question. So right off the cuff, I mean, some of the biggest challenges we typically face are access to capital as well as sufficient education. So each of those has like different aspects of people trying to help with those things, but like getting the money you need to get started. And then like if you need a larger infusion of capital to expand. So we're getting to be more co-op friendly lenders who understand the lending needs of cooperatives, but they're still very specialized. So a lot of what has to happen is those like co-op friendly lenders have to educate their peers to make access to capital easier for co-ops. It's a major challenge that we're facing. Likewise with education, like we need our higher education facilities, we need schools, we need business schools, primary schools, teaching cooperatives, like the way that they might teach future farmers of America, for example, like we need future cooperators of America. No jest, like we need to teach kids, you need all different levels of education about how this is going to happen. When there are major disagreements, that can be a major problem for co-ops for sure. There's not necessarily a magic solution, but groups like Sociocracy, for example, are like really leaders. Ted Rao with groups like Ted was the creator of Sociocracy. They create really dynamic models where like people plug into decisions that affect them and have different powers, including a veto power. If something is critically going against the meaning of the cooperative, they can veto decisions because someone says, nope, nuclear option, this is terrible. You have the ability to abort a decision as a result of that. So I really encourage models like Sociocracy as a result.
Awesome, thank you. A couple of questions left before we wrap. Paula would like to know, is there an ideal number of people or specific skill sets for an initial steering committee when exploring if a startup conversion is the right move?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. So I typically think no less than 3, maybe as much as 9. I think typically 5 or 7 is a sweet spot of like how many people, because you get enough dynamism of thinking and different skill sets, less hopefully like probability of groupthink, or like too much dominating personality going on. Hopefully we can start to already model the kind of power sharing that will be successful for the cooperative when we have a steering committee like that and think about the different assets we'll need to be successful.
Great. And the final question, which I feel like is maybe answered within the slides, but just in case there's anything you want to add, what are your favorite free resources for starting a co-op?
Yeah, no, I tried to throw them in here, but one that I didn't mention that I actually rely on a lot is the University of Wisconsin. They have a Center for Cooperatives that has a lot of like national impact data where you can actually see like economic numbers related to all the different co-ops in the United States. So I really like all of their graphics and a lot of good 101 type resources as well.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much, Matthew. I am feeling very inspired. Judging by the chat, I think we all are feeling inspired to do things a little differently, and very, very grateful for the education today as well. We learned so much in a short amount of time. Yes, Simona, what an incredibly rich session. I couldn't agree more. Amazing. All right, we're going to close out here, friends. This has been such a wonderful time. Thank you so much, Matthew. We're so grateful for the time you've given us today. Some of you know we like to close out field trips with a little gratitude protocol in the form of a chat waterfall. So in the chat, I invite everyone to share one thing they're taking away from the field trip today. Is it a new learning? Is it your next step that Matthew mentioned? What are you going to do next? Maybe it's a feeling or a word. Anything you like. And I invite us all to share our thoughts, and we're going to take a moment and watch the waterfall together and see what's going to happen. Awesome stuff. I love seeing these. Thank you so much, everyone. Wonderful. Okay, a couple of last things. As I said, the chat has been full of such beautiful comments and observations, and just very, very inspiring. So if you'd like to save the chat, please make sure to do so. If you haven't already, you can do this by clicking the 3 dots in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We love your feedback. So if you'd like to, there is going to be a survey that pops up at the end, and you can share your feedback with us. And in one more round of thank yous, I'm going to invite us all to unmute and give Matthew our verbal thanks, our applause, whatever feels good for you. You should be able to unmute now. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Thank you so much. Amazing.
Thank you,
Thank
Matthew.
you. Wonderful,
Amazing.
Matthew. Very
Overjoyed.
beautiful.
Amazing.
Overjoyed.
Gracias. Thank you, Lauren.
Merci beaucoup.
Gracias.
Thank you
It's a
so much,
pleasure.
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. That's it. We did it. I'm so grateful for everyone's time, and I'm going to close out the room. Thanks, everyone, in 3, 2, 1.